Cassie Jo Stoddart was 16 years old. She lived in Pocatello, Idaho, which, if you don't know it, is one of those mid-sized American towns where everybody has some connection to everybody else. Your cousin went to school with somebody's sister. That kind of place. By all accounts, and we're talking teachers, classmates, family, she was just a genuinely good kid. Not a perfect student, valedictorian, overachiever kind of good. Just kind, friendly. The kind of teenager who didn't really have enemies because she wasn't the type to manufacture drama. She had a boyfriend, she had a tight circle of friends, she had a normal 16-year-old life in a small American city.
And she knew the two boys who would eventually kill her. That's the part people always forget. This wasn't a random attack. This wasn't a stranger at a gas station. She knew them. They were, by most definitions, her friends. That matters. That matters a lot. Hold on to that. So here's how September 22nd, 2006 starts. Cassie's aunt and uncle, Allison and Frank Contreras, they own a house in Chubbuck, which is right next to Pocatello. They're going out of town for the weekend. They need someone to house sit, watch the place, make sure nothing goes sideways. They ask Cassie. Cassie says yes.
Cassie's boyfriend, Matt Beckham, comes over to keep her company. That's perfectly normal. That's what teenagers do. And then, and this is where the story starts to get its teeth, two other people show up. Brian Lee Draper, Tori Michael Adamczyk. Both are 17 years old, both classmates of Cassie's, both considered by their peers to be a little off, but the kind of off that you just sort of tolerate in high school because you don't want to be mean about it. They show up at the house. Cassie lets them in. Why wouldn't she? She knew them.
They hang out for a bit. Matt eventually leaves. He has a curfew. His parents want him home. And here is the moment. This is the exact pivot point of the entire night. Matt leaves. Cassie is alone in the house with Brian and Tori. Now, before I tell you what happens next, I need you to understand something about these two boys. Because if I just describe what they did, you're going to think I'm exaggerating. You're going to think I'm adding drama for the sake of it. I'm not. What investigators found, what was eventually played in court, was something that genuinely disturbed seasoned detectives who had seen things, people who had worked violent crime scenes for years.
It wasn't just what they did. It was that they recorded themselves, before, during, and after. Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk, two 17-year-olds from Pocatello. From the outside, regular kids. Went to class, had families. Tori's family was, by many accounts, a pretty stable, normal household. Brian's background was a little more chaotic, but nothing that would have made you say, oh, this kid is going to do something catastrophic. But here's what was going on underneath that. These two had, for quite some time, been obsessed with a very specific fantasy. And I'm choosing that word carefully, fantasy, because that's exactly what investigators and psychologists who later examined the case called it. They were obsessed with becoming famous killers. Not in some vague teenage angst way, specifically. They talked about it. They planned it. They drew inspiration from real killers, particularly Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the Columbine shooters. They had a whole mythology built up in their heads about what it would mean to take a life and get away with it. They wanted to be notorious. They wanted to be studied. They wanted people to say their names. And at some point, investigators believe weeks before September 22nd, they stopped talking about it as a fantasy and started talking about it as a plan. They just needed to pick someone. Back to the house. Matt leaves. It's now Cassie, Brian, and Tori. At some point, Brian and Tori tell Cassie they're going to head out too. They say their goodbyes. They leave through the front door. Except they don't actually leave. They go to their car, and in the car, they already have a bag. Inside the bag, knives and masks. They had brought those to the house on purpose. They go back inside through a different entrance. The house is large. Cassie doesn't hear them come back in. And then they cut the power to the house. Cassie is now alone in the dark, in a large, empty house, and she doesn't know that two people who want to kill her are already inside with her. What happened next, the actual attack, I'm not going to describe in graphic detail. This isn't about shock value. What you need to know is that Cassie Jo Stoddart was stabbed more than 30 times. She fought back. The evidence confirmed that. She did not go quietly. She was 16 years old, and she fought.
She died in that house. Here's the thing, though. Killing her wasn't enough for them. And this is where the story stops being just a tragedy and starts being something that genuinely challenges how you think about evil. Because what Brian and Tori did next, in the hours and days after, is the part of this case that made it nationally significant. That's what I want to get to. But first, let me tell you how they almost got away with it. Cassie's body is found the next morning by her aunt and uncle when they return home. The scene is, according to first responders, extremely violent. This was not subtle. This was not someone trying to cover their tracks. This was frenzied. Police immediately start working outward. Who knew Cassie? Who had access to the house? Who was with her that night?
Matt Beckham, the boyfriend, is obviously one of the first people they talk to. He cooperates fully. He tells them about Brian and Tori being at the house. He tells them when he left, who was there. But here's where it gets strange. When investigators first talk to Brian and Tori, both boys are calm, cooperative even. They say yes, they were at the house. They say they left. They're sad about Cassie. What a tragedy, horrible thing to happen. They are not acting like people who just committed a murder 18 hours earlier. And for a brief window, investigators aren't sure. They have no physical evidence tying Brian or Tori to the scene yet. Forensics takes time. These are two 17-year-olds presenting as grieving classmates.
It could have gone sideways. It genuinely could have. But then a detective makes a decision. He goes to talk to some of their peers, friends, classmates, people on the periphery of their social circle. And one of those people says something. They mention that Brian and Tori had been talking for a while about wanting to kill someone. Not as a joke, not as dark humor the way teenagers sometimes do, as a real thing they wanted to do. That changes everything. Police get a search warrant. What investigators found when they searched changed the trajectory of the case completely. First, physical evidence, DNA at the scene. Details I won't go into, but enough to place both boys at the house after Matt Beckham left. But that's not the thing. The thing that made this case unlike almost any other teen murder case in American legal history was what was on the video camera. Brian and Tori had filmed themselves, not just once, multiple times, before the murder and after. Before the murder, they were on camera, in a car, talking about their plan, using Cassie's name, talking about what they intended to do. At one point on the tape, Brian looks directly at the camera and says something to the effect of, "Tonight is the night." They filmed it like a movie, because in their heads, it was one. After the murder, they filmed themselves again, in that same car, apparently still in the area. They're describing what they just did. They're talking about how they feel. One of them, and this was played in court, says something like, "I don't feel remorse." He says it plainly. Not with satisfaction, not with horror, just as a fact. I don't feel remorse. And then, and this is the part that investigators and prosecutors said haunted them most, he asks the camera, "Did you feel like a god?" 17 years old. In a car, outside a house where a girl they knew was dying or already dead. Asking each other if they felt like gods. I need to pause here. Because I think it's easy, really easy, to hear something like that and just file it away under monsters. Box it up. Those are monsters. Monsters don't think like us. Done.
But the psychologists who examined this case, the people who spent hours with these boys before trial, they said something more complicated than that. They said these boys knew exactly what they were doing. They understood right from wrong. There was no break from reality, no psychosis, no hallucinations. They did it because they wanted to, because they decided to, because they believed, genuinely believed, that it would make them famous and important and studied. One of them, according to court records, compared himself to Hannibal Lecter. He was 17.
That question, how does a 17-year-old get to that place,
is one that criminologists and psychologists are still not fully done answering. And I'll get to what the experts actually concluded, because it's not what you'd expect. But first, the trial. Both Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk were charged as adults. In Idaho, the severity of the crime allowed prosecutors to pursue that. Both were charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The defense, predictably, tried different angles. For Tori specifically, his attorneys argued that he was under Brian's influence, that Brian was the dominant personality, the one who drove the plan, and that Tori was essentially pulled along by someone more forceful than him.
It's worth noting, Tori's family was present throughout. His parents were there. His mother, by multiple accounts, was absolutely devastated. This was not a family that saw it coming. This was not a household that raised a killer in any obvious way. But here's the problem with the "I was influenced" defense when there's a video camera. You can hear Tori on those tapes. You can hear his voice. You can hear him engaging, planning, recounting. It's not the voice of someone being dragged along. Investigators and the jury apparently agreed. Both boys were convicted. Both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tori's attorneys have appealed multiple times over the years, arguing the sentence, life without parole for someone who was 17 at the time, constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under subsequent Supreme Court rulings about juvenile sentencing. And this is where the case stops being just a historical true crime story and becomes something that's still alive, still contested, still working its way through courts, because the law changed. And that raises a question that nobody in the true crime space talks about enough. What do you do when the punishment handed down was legal then, but might not be legal now? I'll get to that. I want to come back to something before we go further. Cassie's family. Her parents, her mom Anna, her dad, have spent years doing something incredibly difficult. They've had to exist in a world where their daughter's name is attached to the two people who killed her. We're Googling Cassie Jo Stoddart returns results about Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk first.
Her mom, Anna, has spoken publicly over the years. Not frequently, not performatively, but when she has spoken, she's been direct. She's talked about how Cassie was more than this case. She was funny, she was creative, she had opinions and a laugh that her family still hears in their heads. And she's talked about the parole hearings, the appeals. Every time Tori's attorneys file something new, that family has to re-engage with the worst thing that ever happened to them. That's the part of true crime that YouTube thumbnails don't usually feature. The family doesn't get to move on, not really, because the legal system keeps pulling them back in. Okay, so here's where I want to slow down.
Because I've given you the crime. I've given you the trial. I've given you the sentence. But there is a layer to this case that goes beyond the facts of what happened in that house. And it's the question that criminologists, people who study violent crime for a living, have been picking apart for years. These two boys didn't snap. There was no fight, no escalating conflict, no moment of passion. This was premeditated over weeks, possibly months. The victim was chosen. The weapons were acquired. The night was selected. And they filmed it. Why does a 17-year-old film a murder? The answer, the real answer, is more disturbing than they were crazy. Because crazy would be simpler. Crazy would be easier to put away and forget. The answer has to do with something that criminologists call media-driven fantasy violence. The idea that consuming enough violent media, not just watching it, but consuming it obsessively and using it to build an identity, can, in certain personalities, blur the line between watching and doing. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were specifically mentioned in the videos Brian and Tori recorded. They referenced them. They modeled their thinking on them. And here's the uncomfortable part. Columbine happened in 1999. Brian and Tori were 8 years old. They grew up in the aftermath of Columbine. They grew up with access to everything that Harris and Klebold produced. The diaries, the basement tapes, all of it eventually circulated online. Is that causation? No. Millions of kids consumed the same material and never hurt anyone. But is it part of the picture? Every expert who examined this case said yes. As of the most recent public record,
And this is important. Both Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk are still incarcerated in Idaho. Tori's legal team has repeatedly challenged his sentence based on Miller v. Alabama, a 2012 Supreme Court ruling that said mandatory life without parole for juveniles is unconstitutional. The argument being that 17-year-olds neurologically are not fully developed adults, and that the justice system needs to account for that. Idaho courts have, so far, upheld the original sentence, but the appeals are not exhausted. Brian Draper has been less visible in the public record post-conviction. He's also serving life without parole.
Cassie's family has shown up to every relevant hearing. Every time this case surfaces, they surface with it. So here's the thing I've been sitting with while putting this together. This case does not have a clean ending. There's no moment where you go, okay, justice served, everyone got what they deserved, we can close the book. Because Cassie's family is still living with an open wound every time an appeal gets filed. Because the courts are still debating whether the sentence was proportionate. Because the videos those boys made are still somewhere in an evidence archive, existing as documentation of exactly how cold and deliberate this was. And because the question of what created Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk is one that we as a society have not actually answered.
We're better at naming things than fixing them. We're better at sentences than we are at prevention. And every case like this, every premeditated murder committed by someone who was technically a child, forces that conversation back to the surface, whether we want to have it or not. But here's what I keep coming back to. Cassie Jo Stoddart was not a cautionary tale. She was not a lesson. She was a 16-year-old girl who said yes to house sitting for her aunt and uncle one Friday night. She trusted two people she knew, and that trust cost her everything.
There's one detail from this case that I haven't mentioned yet. Something that came out in court that even people who closely followed the case often don't know. It has to do with what was found in Tori Adamczyk's room. Not the videos, something else, something written. And when you hear it, when you understand what it meant in context, it reframes the entire question of whether either of these boys ever actually saw Cassie Jo as a human being. I'll cover that in the follow-up, because some things deserve their own space. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching. If you want more deep-dive true crime stories told with detail and respect, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.